So what we are going to attend now and participating now is your thesis seminar, Aliya, which is focused on your PhD dissertation in process about plant thinking and plant philosophy and art and mysticism. I'm actually not quite updated to what your present title for it is. I only know the subject, and we have had each of the readers here a really interesting excerpt focused on Hilma of Klint, and we have also an outline of what you think your dissertation is going to contain chapter-wise. And I hope that both Simone and Michael are here, because they will be your opponents now. I mean, you will first present your project, and after that, each of the two opponents will then give comments and pose questions to your ongoing research, and you will have the possibility to respond. And in the end, I will try to wrap up a bit, and it's also possible then to direct the panel towards the whole audience, so that also external listeners can present questions and comments to what have been presented. So I would just like to say that we're really happy to have on the one hand Michael Marder, who is research professor of philosophy at the University of the Basque Country, Vitoria-Gasteiz, and his writings, as we have already heard, you presented yesterday, spans the fields of ecological theory and phenomenology and political thought also. And Michael is the author of numerous articles and 17 monographs, including Plant Thinking from 2013, Phenomena Critique Logos from 2014, and also Dumb Philosophy from last year, and Hegel's Energy from this year, among many others. And then we have Simone Kotva, who is a research fellow of Emmanuel College at Cambridge, and who's also joining the project called Ambivalence of Nordic Nature, Gift, Guilt, Grace, taking place at the Faculty of Theology in Oslo. And Simone Kotva's first book is called Effort and Grace on the Spiritual Exercise of Philosophy, published with Bloomsbury last year, tackling the importance of Simone Weil's concept of attention for critical theory and practice today, and situating it within the history of French reflexive or spiritualist philosophy. I think in order to really use the time, we only have a little more than an hour. I will give now the word to Aliya, who will present the outline of her thesis. Please, Aliya.
Thank you, Jakob. I have to say that I don't particularly like the word opponent, but I do appreciate the fact that you stress the fact it's an ongoing research, which is definitely what it is. And the draft title of my thesis is Art, Spirit, and Plants on Vegetal and Mystical Thinking. And today, as Jakob mentioned, I'm going to focus predominantly on vegetal abstraction and work of Hilma of Klint. So quite a departure from our previous panel. So my thesis is primarily inspired by and concerned with the phenomena of vegetal minds and the notion of plant thinking. And it aims to consider the healing and transformative potential of humans' engagement with the vegetal model of thought. So as a by no means mature scholar, but certainly an aspiring scholar, I'm paraphrasing T.S. Eliot here, that I do, of course, borrow and still And so when it comes to the notion of plant thinking, it's a concept that I still in its entirety and probably butchering along the way from the philosopher Michael Marder, an author of Plant Thinking, A Philosophy of Vegetable Life, which has been brought up a few times in this conference already. As Marder summarizes, in keeping with vegetal ontology, plant thinking practice an embodied, finite, and material expression. It is wholly oriented to the other without establishing either an identity or a self-identity, and it stands for the impersonal, non-individuated it thinks, which underlies and subverts the ever-present synthesis of I think, the kind of the typical accompaniment of conscious representations in humans. So plant thinking really is a living subversion. Vegetal existence deconstructs many of the dichotomies of a traditional humanist and anthropocentric worldviews, from a separation between the soul and the body, as well as the distinction between self and other, depth and surface, life and death, the one and the many, and so forth. And at the same time, it is also the plant thinking denotes the process of bringing human thought itself towards the plant, and thinking about how human thinking is to some extent humanized and rendered plant-like, altered by its encounter with the vegetable world. So in my approach, and here is sort of a twist of the plot, what I propose is that it is not solely the encounters with the vegetable world that can facilitate the vegetable model of thought in us, but rather I also propose to extend those affordances to mystical and spiritual experiences. While we cannot access plant minds in a direct way, perhaps we can attempt to approach forms of inner experience that go beyond a rational conceptualization of the world and the perspective of a brain-centric mind, and thus get closer to what Michael defines as plant thinking. In Through Vegetable Being, another wonderful book co-authored by Marder and philosopher Lucy Irigaray refers to this very conflation of mystical and the vegetal when she notes of her own experience of how the combination of the sensible qualities of the flower gathers me, and then how she's brought from concentration to contemplation. And if she takes time to leave such a state, it can be converted into sort of ecstasy. So arguably an ecstatic moment that mirrors and reverses Irigaray's experience, I just quoted, can help us discern the constitutive vegetal otherness in ourselves, taking us to this very proximity with the key aspects of vegetal ontology, namely impersonal, non-individuated, non-ideational, non-imagistic, it thinks. So in my research, I aim to demonstrate and ponder this concealed and yet irrefutable interconnection between spiritual and ecological thinking and mystical practice, as seen through the prism of such 20th century artists like Hilma, Klint, and Emma Kunz. And I'm interested in artist mystics' relationship with the botanical world, their use of plants and gardening for healing, caring, and artistic invention. And furthermore, my project aims to consider the healing and transformative potential of humans' engagement with the vegetal model of thought. And it is concerned with the ecological promise of mystical experiences and whether they can promote a mutually caring and non-destructive cohabitation of human and more-than-human worlds. Focusing thus on the intersection of art, plants, and the sacred, I explore mystical states as a crystallization and intensification of a prolonged spiritual search, asking how and whether visionary moments can bring us closer to the vegetal and more broadly non-human worlds, and how can art communicate this renewed form of vegetal thinking induced by the experience of mystical oneness and the divine. From artists whose life and work are profoundly informed by their spiritual journey and healing practices involving gardening and plants. And there's no better place to start with this inquiry than the work of Hilma Klint. But before I move to discussion of some of the examples of her work, I wanted to stop for a minute or two on this concept, which I find quite useful for this consideration of conflation of the vegetal and the mystical, which is a concept of sublime as a kind of medicine against disenchantment, or perhaps against devastation of being, or ariditas that Michael spoke about last night. So I'm interested less in the notion of sublime, which is closely associated with the Romantic movement, a quality of greatness and grandeur that inspires awe and wonder, but rather sublime as the intense moment of unknowing, when the self is forced to remain in intolerable non-knowledge, which has no other way out than ecstasy, quoting Bataille. The sublime moment stretches beyond language and rational conceptualizations, and we can only approach it faltering. So drawing on the writing of Carl Jung, George Bataille, Lucy Irigaray, Amy Hollywood, and probably many others, I aim to reconceptualize the sublime towards vegetal, healing, ecological, and feminine notions. Sublime, I argue, could be delineated as a transformative experience that brings the intensification of being in the present. And such intensification points to the dissolution of the individuated self, and thus bears qualities linking it to the vegetal thought and to its deconstructive capacities. Ecstasy, which comes from Greek ekstasis, to stand outside of oneself, to be drawn beyond oneself to some larger reality. It denotes a sense of overflowing, indeterminate, and porous character of experience. Here, the self and the world can no longer be distinguished one from another. So when we go through an intense transformative experience of facing otherworldly and non-communicable beauty and the divine in art, nature, and mystical and psychedelic states, our sense of a self and its relation to the world crumbles. And from this temporary dislocation, we then return feeling more whole, more at peace with ourselves and the world. What arises out of a sublime dissolution of a self is empathy, openness to the other, that echoes Planck's immanent, unrestricted openness to the world. Ecstasy kindles intimacy, regard for, and knowledge of a living world. So can the work of artist mystics, stemming from the spiritual insights and ecstatic visions, signal the departure from the rigid logic of a presumably highest thoughts, the human reason? And might we see this new weird reciprocity between human and vegetal thought? So this is why I'm interested in prolonged spiritual path and pursuits of religious mystics and artist mystics as figures that inhabit an alternative reality system, to quote Federica Campagna, serving as healers to individual beings as much to the system of the worlding that these beings inhabit and world. So moving on to the work of Hilma af Klint. As perhaps I already made clear, I'm particularly interested in her spiritual path, and particularly in those aspects of it that reveal the artist's relationship with and study of nature and plants. And her interest in botanical and medicinal properties of plants arguably is a crucial aspect of her cosmological vision, which finds form and expression in her works. I actually don't have time to give you a sort of broad overview of her practice, but just to note very briefly, for those of you who don't know, Hilma af Klint is a Swedish artist. She was born in 1862 in the family of naval engineers. She trained as an artist professionally, so she went to an art school, and her early work is sort of quite traditional naturalist landscape and portrait painting and botanical studies. But she was also very interested in a wide range of religious and spiritual teachings. And she participated in seances. And it's during one of those seances in 1904 that she received a call from the higher masters who gave her a task of producing the work. And so she took up this project assigned to her, by those higher masters. And over the next few decades of her life, she produced an absolutely extraordinary body of abstract work, which we're learning about a lot today. And the painting that you see on the right is a work that has been described by of Klint's spiritual teacher Rudolf Steiner as a kind of a spiritual self-portrait of Klint. Moving on to her plant studies and her esoteric botanical pursuits. So a significant proportion of Klint's drawings and paintings carry botanical symbols, and as well as arguably the ideas that resonate with the digital model of thinking, the ideas that botanical world could have taught of Klint. Botanical illustration featured prominently in her early naturalistic work that you can see here. And it was followed by endless vegetal elements in her automatic drawings and mediumistic paintings through to spiritual and transcendental explorations of her late work. And some of this botanical language was already received in her early seances with the femme, or the group of 5 women with whom she met regularly for spiritual explorations and seances. And as you can see, actually, in this work, I already scrolled through the one on the left. Already here, we can see the spirals, roses, the lilies, the twisting tendrils, everything that's going to appear again and again in later work. As art historian David Lomas aims to demonstrate in his essay, The Botanical Roots of Hilma af Klint's Abstraction, her botanical pursuits may have given impetus to her late development of abstract language. But this relationship is not simply formal. Moving beyond morphological parallels, for af Klint, the vegetal world is to explore and express her inquiries into the nature of the real and all existent. In her abstract work, she connects the insights from her spiritual pursuits as much as the profound teachings of a natural world that stem from her close attention, observation, and research. The source of Klint's increasingly pure abstract forms is to be found in her notebooks, her meticulous studies of plants, trees, lichens, mosses, that reveal the true source of her abstraction is not some immaterial, transcendental spirit, but living beings in their full materiality. She combined illustration from nature with geometric abstraction, external observation with mystical notions, and botanical precision with spiritually symbolic geometric forms. A passage in her notebook dated 1917 reveals her fervent study of nature and almost pantheistic immersion in it, suggesting perhaps a kind of mystical communion with the natural or modern human world. And she writes how she will try to understand the flowers of the earth and will take as her starting point the plants, and then how she will penetrate the forest, study the moist mosses, all the trees of the forest, and all the animals that dwell among the cool, dark mosses of the trees. So, as I argue, af Klint's naturalistic studies do not just accompany her abstract work, they are feeding it, and they are its direct source, the vegetal source. Af Klint was also very much interested in sciences, and that's something that was quite common for intellectuals of her age. And a lot of her abstractions is really kind of like a diagram which combine the spiritual and the scientific notions. And one of such diagrams, prominent ones, is the diagram of a sacred tree. The sacred tree is a symbol which is very common in spiritual and ecological traditions. It presents the model of a universe and the union of different realms of existence in the shape of a tree. So the tree, as it grows, it connects the underworld and the heavens. And in Buddhism, for example, Buddha gained enlightenment under the sacred fig, the Bodhi tree. In Christianity, there are 2 trees, as you know. There is a tree of life and there is a tree of knowledge of good and evil. And here I combine some what I thought were quite fascinating examples of sacred trees in various cultural and mythological traditions. You can see an Assyrian tree of life. You can see a book of prayers on the right. The image in the top center is quite quirky. It's a piece of jewelry dating 100, and it was found on the territory of Kiev and Rus, and so it dates sort of almost straight after the present-day Russia was Christianized in 1988. And you can see these two birds flanking what looks like a very abstract representation of a tree of life. Then there is this beautiful carved lattice window in a mosque in Ahmedabad, and the one in the center at the bottom is a Chinese tree of life, which is at least 3,000-4,000 years old and is 4 meters tall. It was excavated in the 1980s in China. But a little bit closer to Klint, in Scandinavian mythology, the sacred tree, Yggdrasil, is a gigantic evergreen ash that grows in the center of the world. Situated at the center of the cosmos, it relates both to the underworld and to heaven. So it's a symbol of universality. And Hilma of Klint was no doubt aware of his very spiritual traditions, which she studied extensively, and she had a very vast library of mystical and occult and religious writings. And she has applied the iconography of a sacred tree in her own work in a series called The Tree of Knowledge, which is a series of watercolors from 1913 to 1915. And in this series, you see 7 abstract depictions of Yggdrasil. And the 8th painting, it's the one you see on the right here. It sort of zooms in on the details of the previous one. So given that the sacred tree stands for the perfect order and humanity, and harmony of the cosmos, and the ceaseless activity of life, as it pours forth its creative abundance, the themes that Hilma was deeply connected with, it's unsurprising that she chooses the sacred tree for her artistic exploration. She also has likely come Helena Blavatsky, namely the Secret Doctrine, which expands upon the symbolism of the Tree of Life. And again, I don't really have much time to show you different symbols, but they're very, there is so much complexity in this work, so I just invite you to have a look in your spare moment. But I will give you one example, which is the color symbolism in Klint's work. And really, a lot of her paintings and drawings, you see yellow and blue lines. And they stand for feminine and male principles. And in this kind of later trees in this series, you can see that the yellow and blue start combining into the green. Because of course, if you mix yellow and blue, you get the green. And the green starts for the synecdoche for all living beings, as Michael has spoken about last night. Also incidentally, or perhaps not incidentally, in plants, in flowering plants, they actually happen to be hermaphroditic. So they do combine the male and female elements and bringing this union between the two. Moving towards the very end of my presentation, just wanted to show you a few examples of her late works, which for me represent sort of the culmination of her abstract language through the vegetal. By 1922, Klint gives up painting geometric compositions, and she started painting this wet-on-wet watercolors, creating over 200 works within a more anthroposophical approach, allowing the colors to generate the subject matter in her quest to portray the spiritual forces present in nature. So she used her clairvoyant spiritual scientific research into the natural world, recording the results of such investigations. And a crucial group of works in the series is titled On the Viewing of Flowers and Trees, which reveals how Klint worked with plants as a meditative focus, thus showcasing her close attention to the vegetal creatures, as well as close spiritual and emotional bond with the more-than-human world around her. And the works in this series undoubtedly relate to meditative exercises prescribed by Steiner in his book, How to Know Higher Worlds. These exercises call a practitioner to patiently and devotedly observe life in the natural world. And interestingly, he, in one exercise, he asks us to direct the attention towards that which is living, growing, and flourishing, and in another, towards that which is dying and decaying. And the idea of those exercises was to build inner spiritual organs of clairvoyance that will enable the student to experience the invisible astral plane that lies behind the world we experience with our ordinary senses. And as I mentioned, these late works for me are really the culmination of a vegetal thought. It the final move towards total abstraction and total move towards non-ideation or non-imagistic representation, the viewing of plants and mimicking the thinking of plants. And the quest for invisible realm of spirituality beyond the material world has been, and as well as including the material world, as Hilma of Klint's work demonstrates, has been recognized as providing a thrust to early abstract art. But one is reminded that for certain spiritual teachers like Steiner and certain artists like Hilma of Klint, and even biologists of that time, such as Raoul Francais, plants were not outside of this quest, but also partook of a spiritual and mystical dimension. So arguably, F. Klint, through her combined visionary botanical pursuits, achieved a state of attunement with the world that mimics the thought of plants, and its radical openness and receptivity, and in stark contrast to the self-idealization of a traditional view of the artist. Hers was a life of visionary moments, but also quiet contemplation, imagination, experience, belief, silent observing, and listening to the other, whether the spirit other or the plant other. But I'm going to end my presentation here, and I look forward to listening to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aliya, for your presentation. I think now we can have the round with two commentators, and would it be okay that we started with Simone? Simone Kotva, could you please give your comments?
Simone, we can't.
I think you should turn on your microphone.
It seems to be on, but we can't hear you.
Can you hear me well now?
Yes.
Good, thanks. Yeah, sorry, my daughter's homesick, so I'm also having to negotiate. But yeah, thank you so much. I have lots of questions, and but first I wanted to, I'll divide it into two parts. Yeah, just give me 1 second, and I'm just going to take care of this very tired toddler. Good job, yeah. Okay, so yeah, I'll divide it into two parts. First, I just wanted to give a sort of a sense of the arguments so far that you've presented in the material that you've supplied us with. And then I'm going to open up to some questions arising. And I mean, part of this is going to be, you've not written it all yet, I've just seen parts of it. So I'm sure, and in the presentation, did you point towards some of the things that I was already wondering about? So anyway, but I'm really excited and curious to hear about it. So first of all, I love the way you you draw these two seemingly disparate things together, sort of basically a philosophy, a rethinking of agency, of human agency with plant thinking. And I think this is really important, very timely, and kind of takes what I've also sort of benefited from reading Michael's work, this idea that when we think passivity and what it means, we're not just thinking about the non-human, but also those ways in which we perceive the world that have been sort of relegated to you know, the bottom of the hierarchy within ourselves, right? And so the ramifications of a philosophy that emphasizes, and this is something I'm going to be talking about later in my talk as well, because it's going through my head too, you know, dependency rather than autonomy, receptivity rather than kind of power over. You call it a mediumistic a mediumistic agency, non-possessive forms of thinking. And I think this is really key in terms of how your work is positioned in the broader field of not just mysticism and Klint, but philosophy, right? And why this matters for today, because we're all looking for alternative accounts of agency, ways of re-narrating what it means to be us, whatever that means, in a more than human world. And I think you do that really well. And so that's very exciting. Why plant thinking matters to kind of rethinking of philosophy as a whole. So, and then you bring in these also kind of marginalized, not just marginalized non-humans, but marginalized artists whose ways of practicing have been sort of suspended from the discussion of their work. So I really like the way you link the critique of really kind of a critique of the self-possessed Enlightenment subject to the way in which Klint has been misread, right? And I think that's something that you could emphasize more. It's kind of this idea of her as she has to be the sole possessor of what she produces, right? And how that, I mean, I really like that section in the chapter on Klint that you sort of very, very carefully and painstakingly show that there is this tendency to, and it's a well-meaning one, to read agency back in. And it's not really a case of you wanting to take agency away from Klint, but rethinking what we mean by agency. And that's something which I found very rewarding with your work, because it's not a question of saying that she somehow is completely passive in a sort of simple sense of passivity. It's that her way of acting is modulated by like receptivity. So those were my opening sort of excitement at your work and what it does, and then how it opens to, of course, kind of more of my field, which is philosophical theology, studying mysticism and so on. You are studying thinkers who are not, who are sort of on the margins also of, or they're liminal, they're between theology and kind of sort of a secular spirituality. I mean, Klint would consider herself, I mean, anthroposophy and theosophy were Christian culturally, but also were sort of pushing the boundaries of Christian spirituality. And so what I love about your connecting plant thinking to this tradition is that you show how it forces Christianity, the Christian mysticism, to kind of face up to itself. That's a kind of sub, I guess, a sub-theme, which I find very exciting, but which leads me to the kind of questions that I have, I guess. And so the questions are really about, partly, I mean, the material you've shown has doesn't really theorize yet how you're going to think about what you call the sacred and what you describe as the remedial promise of ecstatic experience. And partly that's because that's not the material that you've given us. But I'm really curious to hear, how are you going to do that? Because it's a bit of a challenge. And you talk about the scholars of mysticism that you're going to think with. And I just really want to hear more about how you're going to think the sacred and the ecstatic, especially with regarding such kind of liminal figures. I don't think it's going to be problematic, but I just really want to know how you're envisioning it. And then I'm also got a question about Bergson. So really fascinating and extensive section on Bergson. So I got the sense that Bergson was functioning as a kind of a way of giving a kind of theory of this passive action, passive awareness that you then use to think human agency, right? So not just plant thinking, but sort of translating those ideas of that paradoxical passive action into a philosophy that has focused more on like intuition and so on. And Bergson makes sense to me historically in relation to Klint. I don't know if that was why he came in. But there were also some sort of problems, kind of doubts about Bergson's Bergson here, and I was wondering how you were going to how you were thinking about him, because I mean, Bergson really liked intuition and this idea, as you bring out, that intellect, by which he kind of generalizes the sort of the sequence thinking, right? There are things that it can never find, but it searches for, which intuition finds but doesn't search for, right? And that idea of like the immediately given is really fascinating to him. But he also has this kind of strange hatred, really, or like phobia for what you refer to briefly as like automatism. He doesn't really like habit. He doesn't really like passivity. And I wonder if that can become like a way in which Klint sort of can critique Bergson, because I like having Bergson there. I think it makes sense historically, but I'm also wondering to what extent you're actually kind of really going beyond him. He's a good starting point, but the way you could use Klint, sorry, use is the wrong word, but we understand in the academic context, but you would think with Klint as a critic of that Bergsonian idea. So that, okay. So those were my thoughts about Bergson, because I thought it made a lot of sense, but also that there was more critical potential here in Klint as a thinker who sort of moves beyond that. Because I was trying to really make sense of how Klint would fit into Bergson's scheme, and I thought actually she sort of breaks it and again kind of attenuates it a bit. So I don't know how I've gone. I think I was told I had 10 minutes. I'm not sure where we are time-wise.
Okay.
But I should probably stop there.
Yeah, maybe Aliya will respond to those questions right away.
Sure. Thank you so much for your very generous comments, Simone. I'm really excited to have a chance for you to have read my work. So I'm gonna try as much as I can, or as little as I can, to respond to some of your commentary. First of all, in terms of how I think of a sacred and the ecstatic, and how am I trying to theorize those particular experiences. So I think what I try to demonstrate in the presentation today, that for me, those kind of experiences, they come together in this notion of sublime. And I'm using it because it kind of sits interestingly between also, of course, art history and aesthetics, which is ultimately the field in which I'm trying to apply these notions, but also through the reading of thinkers like Bataille at the beginning of 20th century. As you said, it sort of helps to reconceptualize the sublime in a way that is very different from the earlier notions of the way it was theorized in the 18th and 19th century. And that's where my, I guess, fascination and my interest towards thinkers like him and those thinkers who try to rethink the notion of sublime comes from. So for me, it's this idea of a sublime which sits at the center of the sacred and the ecstatic. And ultimately what I'm trying to show, that the digital model of thought also actually links quite neatly with the sublime experience. So I think that that's the way I'm trying to approach it. I think one of the major problems with my method of work is that I cherry pick what I like. And that happens across all theories that I read. And yeah, so I sort of pick the ideas that I find fitting my argument. And that's where some perhaps inconsistencies come from. Because I have a certain project in my head, and then whatever I read and whatever comes my way, that's why I'm trying to feed my ideas from. So instead of kind of trying to fit neatly into any existing strictly delineate frameworks and theoretical fields, I'm just creating this dump of ideas and borrowing and stealing and being inspired by thinkers across fields, both in philosophy and theology. So in terms of my interest in Bergson, as you said, and I think actually, funny enough, and again, that comes from my inconsistencies. When I first got interested in Bergson, I did it for reasons unrelated to the fact that it's actually sits quite well with Hilma of Klint because of the historical proximity and because of the importance of Bergson for that particular generation of intellectuals. So again, I was just reading Creative Evolution, and for me, it was quite a, I just loved the way that his ideas around intuition tie very well and neatly with my search for theorizations of experiences and forms of thinking which go beyond this rational, logocentric, brain-centric way of thinking that we that we normally kind of put as the ultimate human faculty. So that's where my interest in Bergson comes from. I have to say that your comment about of Klint going sort of beyond Bergson, I find it interesting, and perhaps I'm not sure I actually follow it thoroughly, and it's definitely something I want to think through. In which ways you think Hilma of Klint goes beyond Bergson? It's something, yeah, I personally haven't thought of, and I'm grateful for your remark on that particular front.
Do you want to answer that, Simone, or because I think maybe we should soon end this part of the session and move on to Michael in order to
yeah. I'll just say there was just one thought that came to me. I'm not going to take the whole. We can talk about the Klimt in detail at some other point. But it just, the thing about Bergson is he was very, very suspicious and distrustful of mediumship. I think that's whether another. And so it's also, I mean, I became very fascinated by Steiner's role in this as I was reading. Maybe Michael will have similar questions, but you know, the sort of the way he mediates between Goethe and something else. So I wanted to know more about Steiner, but maybe perhaps more than Bergson. So those are some of the things. But yeah, his distrust of mediumship and actually distaste for people like Klint operating in Paris at the time and the UK. It's kind of an interesting, like, a source of friction there. So yeah, but let's talk more about Klint between us another time.
To respond very briefly, I think it's interesting how Klint's own mediumship has evolutionized in the course of her life and career, because if initially she was kind of following the voice of a spirit in its entirety, she was literally just translating whatever has come through and been channeled to her. Then she sort of balanced it in her later years and in her later works with a more, with an approach where she was both listening but also trying to sort of garden and that flourish of her own interpretation of those spiritual visions and calls. But yeah, thank you. Perhaps we should.
Okay, it's something to think about. Aliya, I think then we'll say thank you very much to Simone for now, and then continue to Michael Marder.
Yes, thank you also, Aliya, for this presentation. And like you, I don't share the view of my position as an opponent, precisely because plant thinking is non-oppositional thinking. And so it is always a thinking with the other, alongside and temporally and so on. And so in this spirit, I want to raise mostly two broad eye view points about your project that I think might be helpful as a contextualization or as a framework within which other pieces might fit, such as the work of Klint that you present so beautifully. One key point for me is what you mentioned in the very beginning, and in which I see the core of your project. You are turning to plants, to vegetal mysticism, to these sort of ecstatic experiences in the hopes of finding the capacities for healing and transformation, right? These are the two areas that you highlight, healing and transformation. And I think there needs to be a lot of specificity going into the question, what is being healed, even though we obviously have our kind of determined automatic answer to this question, and what is being transformed through this lens or with it. Because my hunch, at least with regard to transformation, is that things are a little bit more complex than saying this or that process or event needs to be transformed. Rather, what needs to be transformed is the very capacity for transformation. Transformation needs to be jump-started from all kinds of stoppages of what I've called elsewhere planetary metabolisms. Right, and if we think about transformation or the becoming itself as consisting of these two moments of metabolism on the one hand and metamorphosis on the other, two supplementary moments that highlight the spatial and the temporal aspects of becoming, right? Metamorphosis is more spatial, it's the change of form, metabolism more temporal, a change of trajectory, as it were, of the throw. So one reason it seems to me to turn to plants would be to relearn metamorphosis and metabolism from them. That is to try to transform our very idea of transformation and to jumpstart, as I said, its possibilities. So I would very much love to hear what you have to say about this kind of the overall aim of the project in relation to the suggestion. The other point, the other broad point, actually very much echoes what Simone was saying, the concern with agency and plant agency as an alternative model for thinking about what behavior is, what doing or praxis or action actually are, outside of the traditional opposition between activity and passivity. And here, I think that going back to the discussion I had with Jakob yesterday on Hildegard, one of the ideas is that agency is achieved at this level through self-effacement. So Hildegard is being plant-like when she faces herself as the messenger, when she says, "Who am I to speak to you, the Pope, the Bishop? I'm just a poor illiterate woman." But this is the effectivity of her address, because in the self-effacement, she turns herself into a medium through which spirit itself speaks, right? And I think that this channeling, this mediation of the word of the other, the word that might be a word in the sense in which we usually associate with verbal expression, but also any sort of communication, right? This is a vegetal model for me, this kind of speaking, addressing to the other through self-effacement by way of turning oneself into a channel for the other. And in that sense, I'm curious to hear what you have to say specifically with regard to of Klint, this important shift with which you ended in her perspectives, that she starts with almost geometric abstractions influenced by the plant world, but she ends in what you call vegetal viewing, where there are no geometrical patterns anymore. And in fact, it is more of an attempt really to see the world from the standpoint of a plant. So there, what is happening, at least it seems to me, is a kind of effacement of figuration. She needs to efface the figure, the geometrical figure, in order for something else to stand out, which is this play of colors themselves, a kind of mosaic of colors, which might approximate actually the world viewed from the standpoint of a plant. And then finally, I know I said two issues, but there is a third one that is very, sort of involved with the other two, the notion of the vegetal sublime. Because you cite Bataille in relation to the sublime as a position of not knowing, of non-knowledge that leads to ecstasy. But in fact, if we take plant thinking seriously, the sublime described in this way, the vegetal sublime, is another mode of knowing. It is not non-know. It is only not knowing from the cognitive standpoint of human knowledge, right? So there needs to be a lot of care and attention there in that regard. And also another issue that is related to the vegetal sublime is the fate of sublimation. Because it seems that what you want is a kind of lingering with this liminal experience of the vegetal sublime without sublimating it into perhaps into other more formal modes of thinking. And on the other hand, art, what is art if not a kind of sublimation, right? For Freud, it was obviously a sublimation of the sexual impulse. Here, what you are suggesting, perhaps interestingly, but very implicitly, and I also want to hear a little bit more on this, is a possibility of a vegetal sublimation, this vegetal sublime being sublimated in a way that does not turn into a human-centered kind of symbolism, and so on and so forth. So is this, my question for you is this vegetal sublime shorn of sublimation? Is it a different kind of sublimation that you are envisaging here? Is it, how does this relate to plant thinking? Because as you know, plant thinking actually ends with the view that philosophy and all of the highest, so-called highest human pursuits are sublimations of plant thinking. Right, so there, I try to develop this alternative model of sublimation precisely in relation to even what we call purely human thinking, that just sublimates these vegetal processes that for Aristotle originally are nourishment and reproduction. We can call them the metabolic and the metamorphic trajectories as well. And I would love to hear more about the way you see this relation between the sublime and sublimation in relation to your central topic in your doctoral research, art, spirit, and plants. Right. So.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was very rich, and it will give me tons of food for thought, or vegetal food for thought. I'll try to respond to some of your comments. Let me just go back and maybe find in my notes what were the actual questions and not just my jottings of the things you have said. So yes, on the question of healing and transformation, I'm grateful to you for bringing up the fact that I don't actually explain what is it I mean by either of the two. And it's definitely something that I have to think through carefully myself and to somehow relate in the body of my presentation. I have to bring this up, and I'm not sure yet to what extent I'm going to include those ideas in my research, but I just wanted to explain to what extent my thinking has been influenced by some of the neuroscientific research which I've been reading up on in the past couple of years, and which really kind of sits alongside of all of these ideas that I'm bringing up, and particularly in its relation to healing. And there's some fascinating research being done at a number of universities in UK and in the States in particular on the healing potential of mystical and ecstatic experiences. And in those kind of research, typically it's a ecstatic state which is induced by the ingestion of plant entheogens, and which actually is it makes sense, because it would be quite difficult to put Hildegard of Bingen in an imperial college lab and to study her, and whereas with the ingestion of a substance you can have a controlled experiment. But what comes out of this research is that there is a clear connection between those ecstatic states and what's called the nature connectedness, as well as the dissolution of ego, which is reported by participants in those experiments. And I find this research fascinating, and I think it's very important. And I think in a lot of ways, it's a very new area of research. I think in a lot of ways, those scientists are kind of struggling to actually explain themselves. Okay, we see those relationships happening and we see those connections between this sense of relatedness to the more-than-human world following the ecstatic experience, but how can we actually explain that? And I think I kind of ambitiously see my own project to some extent trying to reflect on that particular connection. So how can we, from a position of humanities, explain this particular connections that we see in the neuroscientific research being carried out today? So when it comes to healing, it is this psychological and psychotherapeutic healing, first of all, that we witness in this kind of experiences. But when it comes to transformation, I think I've used the word a little bit too freely, and I think it's really for me to be definitely more precise in what it is that is being transformed and what kind of metamorphosis do I envisage with this inclusion of the vegetal model of thought. Ultimately, everything metamorphosizes over time. So what kind of metamorphosis are we trying to bring about? It's a question worth pondering on. When it comes to your second question, okay, so agency achieved through self-effacement. Again, it's a really another area of that needs a lot of consideration. But as you were talking about Hildegard of Bingen and her approach of this achieving agency for self-effacement, I couldn't help but think of Hildegard of Bingen's position in her time, when perhaps her speaking about herself as this poor woman was also part of sort of her political strategy in order to be heard. And as it was quite common for that age, when, as Amy Hollywood writes in her critique, that the voice of woman has been historically silenced, as we all well know, but including in theology. And as women did not have access to theological knowledge and education in the medieval times, it is often that we hear their voices through those ecstatic and mystical experiences that they had. And it's sort of what allowed them to have a voice and to leave us those writings which ultimately reached our age. But it's not kind of through the academic and scholarly approach of scholars, theologians, but through ecstatic experiences and through bodily experiences that we obtained this knowledge today. So I thought that we could think about the self-effacement both in vegetal terms, but also in political feminist terms. And when it comes to Hilma of Klint, it's not that different, because again, the art world of that period was entirely male-dominated. And she was actually one of the very first artists in Sweden to attend an art school. And the discourse at the time was very much dominated by the male artist. So I'm not sure, I'm actually not sure yet to what extent her removal of herself from the art scene of that time was a kind of conscious self-effacement, or to what extent it was the result of her spiritual pursuits, because she kind of saw her her higher purposes elsewhere. We know that she actually did try to exhibit her work during her lifetime, not very successfully, as in like she actually hardly had any exhibitions. And then ultimately both Hilma of Klint and Emma Kunz, another artist I'm really interested in, they both understood that their art was meant for the future. So, and it was not to be understood by their contemporaries. And it's only, now at the beginning of the 21st century that we start to appreciate their work so much. So I think I have to kind of both, approach this question of agency carefully both as through the critical plant approach, but perhaps also through critical feminine approach, if that makes sense, as I think ultimately both of them are relevant. And when it comes to Vegetal Sublime, I think that's a question it's a very difficult one, and I'm not sure I'm able to respond right now. I think what I ultimately fault myself with is that whilst being interested, and as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, my primary concern is the notion of plant thinking, but then ultimately my primary concern is it's how human thinking itself can be rendered plant-like through this experience of a vegetal sublime. So I think I keep kind of going back and forth in my focus from the vegetal to the human, and that comes through also in my interest in understanding how we can other human thinking, and one way of othering it is through this experience of oneness or relatedness to the vegetal world, and that's where like the foundation of this process of vegetal sublimation. But I will definitely give this question more consideration. I don't know if you have any further remarks, Michael, at this point.
Yes, just one very quick thing. I know that we discussed earlier this question of the self-effacement and whether it's strategic or ontological or a mix of the two. And I tend to agree with you that it has to be a mix of the two. It cannot be a purely strategic position on the part of Hildegard to efface herself in order to be heard from the position of a woman of the time. And I'm saying that it cannot be only strategic because of the way she presents her own visions, her own thinking and writing. Even in the letters that she sends, she paints a kind of vegetal picture of her own sending of the letter, that not only does the Spirit, Holy Spirit speaks through her or is sent through her, but the actual sending is vegetal. It's like sending roots and branches, and the sending of the leaf that is detached and is sent then against the work of a devil, for instance, right? So she sees her own, in these moments of self-reflection, she sees her own practice, her own, let's say, mystical communication as on a vegetal model. So that's why I'm led to believe that her self-effacement cannot be only a strategic, purely instrumental kind of position, but has to do in large part with her identification with plant life and letting plant life speak through her, and trying to communicate to others as if she were herself a plant, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is exactly where our joint interest in figures like Hildegard comes through, because exactly as we view them, they did exhibit this vegetal language and the vegetal thought, and their life and their approach and their thinking and their writing and their artistic creation sort of is a testament to the fact that they did connect with this vegetal model of thinking. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, Aliya, I think time is gradually running out, but do we have maybe time for just one question from the audience? Aliya, what do you think?
Yeah, sure. I see there's a long paragraph here, and I'm going to take 10 or 20 or 30 seconds to read it, if I may. Maybe actually I should read it out, because I believe people are not able to see the question. So Matt French is asking how experiences of vegetal sublime may fit or not in relation to Philip the scholar's fourfold typology, modes of identification as between animism, totemism, naturalism, and analogism. The latter is perhaps the obvious category, but I sense an absence of dualism, i.e. separate identities, as being intrinsic to your notion of vegetal sublime. Thinking here of Bataille from in experience, experience attains in the end the fusion of object and subject, being a subject, non-knowledge is object the unknown. Can this become an everyday mode of vegetal relating? So I'm actually not familiar with this particular typology that you quote, Matt, but I am grateful for you bringing it up. And when it comes to Bataille, I do quote this exact phrase in my own writing as well. And it's this self-effacement or this the dissolution of the subject which I'm particularly interested in. Can this become an everyday mode of vegetal relating? Yeah, so I don't think ecstatic experiences is something for every day. I think the point of ecstatic experience is that it's something which is quite rare and which has profound influence on those everyday practices. However, can vegetal relating be an everyday practice? Yes, definitely so, and there are various ways that we can practice that, and I actually very much look forward to Simone's talk, because reading her abstract, I believe she might partially respond to this question of the everyday mode of vegetal relating. So I hope, Matt, that you stay around for Simone's talk to learn more. And I think with this, we're probably running out of time, but if there is another question, I'm very happy to take it.
Maybe I, as having the privilege of being your supervisor, may give you just one question, because I would then present the position of art history here, because it's your project is also about, you know, relating plant philosophy, plant thinking, plant mysticism to works of art, and you have talked about Hilma of Klint and Emma Kunz, but I remember that when you started out with this project, you wanted to go into contemporary art projects, being concerned with the meeting of technology and art, and you seem to have quite left that part and moved into kind of pure vegetal being, so to speak, and you have left out technology, and I mean, maybe the whole inorganic nature. I think that maybe Simone's question is becoming relevant here again in relation to Bergson, because he has this controversy with the intellectual and the intellectual sphere being related to the inorganic. So my question is, did you simply have you left out technology and maybe also every kind of intellectualism thoroughly in your work?
Oh no, I'm not muted. I have to apologize. I actually missed literally half of your question because I think my connection was breaking up. But from what I have heard, is this evolution of my project of being interested in contemporary art and technology in the early stages and abandoning those.
Yes.
So I actually still have a section on technology as a kind of as a final remarks in my outline. I'm not 100% sure it's worth including because I think ultimately it's quite a deviation from my current project. But at the same time, because I think kind of intratemporally or outside the time, I am very much interested in raising some of these questions of how vegetal and mystical thinking can perhaps help us about the artificial intelligence in different ways. And I think it's a consideration that is worth exploring, although I'm not sure it will make a logical conclusion to my project unless as a kind of remarks which point towards the future realities of this research and my interest in the mystical thought. So I'm not entirely abandoning those interests. It's just that I think for the sake of being more, being closer to what I'm truly interested in, which as I discovered is the work of those artist mystics, more so than the some contemporary art ecological explorations, specifically for the purpose of this project, if not overall in my.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that definitely time is running out now. So I will say thank you so much to Michael and to Simone for their really useful comments and questions. And I think there's a lot to think about now, Aliya. And I see that other comments and questions are coming in. But I think you will have to talk to people outside this forum now, because I think we have to proceed. But thank you very much to Michael and Simone, and it was a pleasure to taking part in this discussion.